we were created to provide what today we would call resettlement services, temporary housing, English language instruction, employment assistance, and ultimately to help immigrants integrate successfully into the United States. As time went forward, however, immigration laws were passed, all of which were exclusionary. But the need for Jews to be able to enter the safety of the United States grew, and so HIAS PA began advocating. The advocacy continued and grew through World War II and beyond. In the 1970s, we were asked to help with the integration of Vietnamese and Cambodians. This was a pivotal moment for us, but the Torah, the Jewish book of laws, repeats the commandment to welcome the stranger 36 times. It is the most repeated commandment in the Torah, and so we agreed to help. And since then have been helping people of all faiths and backgrounds, providing both social and legal services to low-income immigrants residing in Pennsylvania. With that as background, again, I'm very pleased to introduce Taylor Shiroff. Welcome.
Thank you for having me. Appreciate it.
Great. I have some questions, but we're also happy to take some from the audience. Please feel free to write your questions in the chat if you have any. Please keep your questions general. If you have specific legal questions or need legal representation, please contact HIAS Pennsylvania directly. We cannot give legal advice on Zoom. So, Mr. Shiroff, tell us what led you to write this incredible history.
Yeah, so I think, growing up, I always just had more questions than answers about, where my family came from, how we got here. I knew that, we weren't always here, but I didn't know sort of how that wound up being the case. And I think part of that stems from, I grew up with my great grandfather around a lot, who was, a child of immigrant parents. And, just anytime that I'd get just a little snippet of what, his life was like as a kid and kind of growing up in a very different age, in a very different circumstance than, the kind of I grew up in. I always just found it very interesting, but I also found that, a lot of the memories of that era were kind of slipping away, and my grandparents hardly knew much, and part of that too was their parents didn't really want to talk about it, or never really said much about it, or they never thought to ask. And unfortunately for me, that wasn't going to work. I needed to know. I wanted to know. And I started just trying to do a simple little family tree, and got maybe a little carried away, but here we are.
That's great. And it's so interesting how much what you described parallels, I think, so many immigrants, even the unwilling ones. My husband is African American, and he's always been upset by his parents' unwillingness to share their history, and a lot of it was very painful. And that's why, and I am a like 8th generation American, and so I know my American family history very well, different from my husband. So I think we're all grateful for your persistence, because I think those stories are really meaningful to all of us. So what were some surprising things that you learned as you did your research?
Yeah, I think the big thing that I just kept being amazed by anytime I saw a different statistic about it is just the scale of it, of the wave of immigration, of Jewish immigration to the United States that, generally speaking, between 1881 and 1924, depends on who you ask, but it's, definitely within the ballpark of 2 to 2.5 million Jewish immigrants in that 40-year period, the majority of whom were really between 1890 and 1910. There were a number of years, I think in the late first decade of the 20th century, there were, 5 or 6 years in a row of over 100,000 Jewish immigrants each year, which, that's a lot of people in a very short period of time. And, even among, because this was also an age where, Jews weren't the only people who were immigrating in the United States. there were Italians and the Irish and others even from Eastern Europe, a lot of Polish immigration as well. But despite the fact that Jews, still, much like today, are a pretty small share of the overall population, between 1890 and 1910 or so, about 1 in 10 immigrants was Jewish, which is just says something about the kind of amazing scale of the migration, but also just of how bad the situation had clearly become, where everybody just kind of had a moment of, we've got to get out of here, and somewhere a bit safer that we can have the kind of life that we would like to have. And especially considering that too, I was also surprised frequently by how almost unknown the Jewish immigration story is among, I think, the popular imagination, compared to, again, I think a lot of people are familiar with, the Irish immigration after the potato famine, and, the immigration of Italians and that sort of thing. But I think I kept running into, not that much stuff being out there for the general public about, the period of Jewish immigration. And I found that also a lot of people just didn't know about it, as kind of another one of these, kind of unbelievable periods of mass migration, if you could call it that. So yeah, I think the scale and the way that it's been remembered, I think, was very surprising to me.
Yeah, and it's so interesting. There's so many things in what you just said. So one thing, the fact that with that level of scale, there clearly was this moment in time when Jews were like, I have to leave. And so often, particularly today in our rhetoric, there's no discussion, or very little or inappropriate discussion, about what brings immigrants to make that really challenging decision. A lot of the political debates today are about passing policies that will, quote unquote, encourage too many immigrants, which is a complete failure to understand the causes of immigration. I don't think any of the Jews, of the, hundreds of thousands of Jews that fled, or the Irish, or any subsequent fleers, were encouraged to come to the United States. They were fleeing. And so policies that are based on a misperception of the causes of migration are never going to get you anywhere, because, trying to discourage migration to people who are fleeing for their lives is a kind of non-starter. So I appreciate your lifting that up. Clearly that scale tells you that harm at home had reached such a significant level that there was no choice. I also think it's interesting, if you travel, and I'm sure you'll talk about this a little bit later, but along the kind of pathway of immigration laws, which I made reference to in the introduction, the immigration law of 1924 was a huge slamming of the door. And that has consistently been the United States' response to large scale migrations that are due to trouble at home. The Chinese Exclusionary Act was the response to so many Chinese coming, and actually that one wasn't in fact fleeing terror. It was a treaty that the United States entered into with China to bring Chinese laborers here to build the railroad. And it was so successful that then the United States got, praised with, oh, there's too many. And so now we have to shut the door. And so hence the Chinese Exclusion Act. But, the Jews were fleeing. And so they came in droves, and then the United States went, oh my goodness, too many, which is kind of our pattern, right?
Yeah, and it's also interesting because it points, you hear the phrase commonly that we're a nation of immigrants, which is true, but I think in the way in which we describe our country as being a a safe foster home for people all over the world who are fleeing trouble. I think we almost have to be careful with assessing our history that way, because I'm not sure that in the long run that that's really true. I think we've failed to do that a lot of the times. I mean, we do it a little bit and then we decide, we tried that. That's enough. We're happy with what we have, and we don't want to have any more. And that's unfortunate, because it tends to be those periods where we are more open that you see all kinds of benefits to society and to the economy and to just really everything, in addition to people just being safer and healthier and happier. um but I don't know if it's historically really been true, at least over the last 100 years, that we've been this sort of uh welcomer of all, that I think sometimes we like to tell ourselves we are. I think many times we've really failed to live up to that sort of standard.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. It's our our diversity as a nation is more due to despite our policies, not because of our policies.
Yes. Yeah.
So I think that makes a lot of sense. So okay, so next book, a question. I mean, often in your book, you refer to similarities in the journeys of other Jewish immigrants at the time that your relatives migrated. What are some things that were unique to your family?
Yeah. So, of course, as I try to emphasize in the book, it's specifically about my family, but in some sense, it's also not, because for the most part, it was a pretty similar ordeal for a lot of people. But I think one thing that was kind of unique, or at least pretty uncommon, that was the case in my family is, so my great grandfather, who I mentioned earlier, so typically the way it worked was, your husband would go first and get somewhere to live, get a job, save up a little bit of money, and then hopefully uh buy tickets and transportation to get the wife and children and whatever other family over to the US, hopefully after not too long. And that was the way it worked for the vast majority of Jewish immigrants, if you had, if you were married and that sort of thing, at least. Um, for my great grandfather, it was actually the other way around, where his mother came first. And not only did she come first, but she came first as an unmarried woman, only dating the man who would be her husband. And the exact reasoning of why she did that is, it depends on who you ask and when you ask to them, because the answers seem to change, and each person has their own version of the story. But the one I like most is that supposedly, she was into this guy who was, he was a hot commodity. Everybody, all the girls wanted him. And you know, my great grandfather's mother was, as I've heard at least, was a bossy and demanding woman, and wasn't going to take no for an answer, and was willing to do whatever, whatever hard work or it took to get what she wanted, and said, listen, how about this? I will go to the US first. I'll do it on my own. And give me some time, and I'll, buy you a ticket, and you'll come join me here. And that's what she did. And she came to the US and worked in a dressmaking factory, and did that for a couple of years, and lo and behold, she did earn enough money to bring him over. And so the story goes, in exchange for all of her hard work and bravery to come here, as I don't know exactly how old she was, but she really couldn't have been much older than 18 or 19. um, the agreement was that when he got here and they got married, that instead of her taking his last name, it would be the other way around, and that's what he did. So they were Rabinowitzes rather than Schustermans. So that's a bit of a unique story. That was a much not particularly common.
That's fascinating. So, I felt so revolutionary that my husband and I took a hyphenated name, and he changed his name too. But clearly, it wasn't that revolutionary since it happened 200 years, and even more so, right? That he took her name in full. They didn't combine their names. That's
Yeah,
great.
well, I think they were quite ahead of their time.
Yes, yes, yes. Um, Also, I think your story emphasizes the matriarchal tradition of Judaism, you know. Oh, and yes, one of our guests said that they were given different names when they arrived, right? Is that true?
So, as I unfortunately don't really have any way to tell because I don't know. I don't really have any records of at least of these people before they came to the U.S. So as far as I know, maybe not. I have no idea. Unfortunately I've yet to come across any sort of birth record or anything uh, they're from northeastern Ukraine. Um, so, but it was the case for a lot of people. My last name wasn't always Shiroff. That was the a highly adjusted version of the name that as the years went on, they just dropped the certain bits, changed how you spelled it, and now it's Shiroff. So
Yeah, for our listeners, in case you haven't gotten the book yet, Taylor does spend some amount of time, which is fascinating, kind of going through names and the name changes that occurred for various reasons. I think it's really interesting. My maiden name is Miller, which I was always told was because my great 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 grandfather was the miller of the town in which he came from. And so he looked up the definition in English of the word that because he was called Arthur Miller, the Miller. And that's what our name became. So I think it's very funny. Okay. So what are some things you know about your relatives' legal ability to come here and live and work? So they came, just remind us again of the years that they came.
yeah, so the earliest I think the year the first of my ancestors came, I think was off the top of my head like 1888, 1889, somewhere in that range, and the last of them arrived I think in 1908. So about that 20-year period.
Great. And so tell us, what was the landscape that they faced? Did they have to get some kind of papers to either enter the United States and to work?
Yeah, it was a totally different ball game than today. Totally different. It's kind of an amazing thing the way this really worked. If you wanted to come to the United States, you had whatever experience it was that just kind of pushed you over the edge and said, that's it. I've got to go, got to get out of here. Um, what you did wasn't, you know, uh, go onto the Department of State's website and start filling out paperwork and getting a visa and all that sort of thing. That there was no equivalent of that at the time. What they did was you would go to the inn, you go to the tavern, and you'd find the guy who seemed to know everybody and was well connected, and ask him if he's heard anything about these people selling tickets to get to the U.S. And odds are he'd say, "Oh yeah, I know that guy, and just bought tickets for somebody through him the other day." And you get your tickets from him, and you wait for the day to arrive. You get on the train, you get to all these different stops along the way for health checks and that sort of thing. You get to the boat, you get on a boat, you arrive in the U.S., and as long as you're generally healthy and there's nothing obviously suspicious about you or anything like that, you were kind of good to go as far as getting into the U.S. was concerned. Which nowadays that does not work. Now that being said, it was uh, well, for one, it was the experience getting here was really unpleasant. Really very unpleasant. There really weren't a lot of things or kind of rules and laws that were in place to kind of keep you safe. And these people really didn't have a lot of rights protecting them from abuse and that sort of thing. And so you were often really at the mercy of the goodwill of other people, which it seems like more often than not people weren't terrible, but that was never guaranteed. And the other thing too is it may have been easier to get here, but you're also arriving with no documentation. You almost certainly had no birth certificate. You almost certainly didn't have a passport. There was no ID. no kind of credit history, no bills. You had nothing that could actually even prove that you were who you claimed you were, other than your name matching what was on the list from the boat. And so, I mean, imagine today walking into a bank and trying to open an account with nothing that can prove who you are, other than your word for it. And so, that was a challenge for a lot of people, which led to the rise of these immigrant banks, where the immigrant community or people close to the immigrant community sort of said, listen, these people obviously they're going to need to have bank accounts, but uh, no bank is going to let them just walk in with nothing and let them open an account, much less lend them any money or something to start a business or whatever. And so they kind of made their own banks and sort of lived off of the community in that sense. So, there was that, but, again, that was still like, you weren't going to get the same kind of services and the same extent of, I guess, financial access that you would have had if you were born here and you had a paper trail kind of confirming who you were. Um, and one other thing too is, so as far as work was concerned, it's kind of interesting. Again, today, the idea of somebody showing up and having no job, no plans of, oh, I'm going to go get a job at this place. And, many people at the time were showing up with no connections in the US. If they were the first in their family to come, first in their town to come, they knew nobody. They had nothing that could really help them. They were totally on their own. Today, obviously, that doesn't work. You're lucky to be able to be a permanent resident even if you have a very high paying, nice job and a good education. Um, so that wasn't the case then, but even still, the kinds of jobs that were available to you were had the potential to be pretty unpleasant. Unfortunately, because as Jewish immigrants, there were a lot of other factors sort of influencing the kind of work that you could and would be able to do. So one is just the fact that a lot of these people had worked in, less industrialized and less modern professions in Eastern Europe. And so, even if they were tailors, their experience with, modern electric, tailoring equipment was pretty limited. And so they weren't really that, helpful in most tailoring shops in the US. And in addition to that, they had, religious factors as well, where, they were going to try to avoid working on the Sabbath if they could. And, they wanted to be able to have off on holy days and that sort of thing. And that meant that you were kind of stuck working for other Jews, which sounds like it would be a good thing, but it wasn't always, unfortunately, the case that that was a good thing, because a lot of the Jewish employers understood all too well that these people kind of were very desperate, and they were in a very vulnerable position. And so, a lot of them wound up, yes, getting jobs, but working in sweatshops and working really long hours and very dangerous and really unpleasant circumstances, and often really for below market pay. And so it was a very different ordeal, but it was it wasn't. I guess you could look at it and say, oh, well, it was kind of nice because these people were able to get here easily, and there weren't all these rules that made it so complicated with work and that sort of thing. But at the same time, there wasn't a lot protecting them from a lot of potential danger, and these people were living paycheck to paycheck in the truest sense, and we're one economic disaster away from being really screwed, which is where organizations like HIAS really kind of came in, because there was nowhere, there was practically no welfare at the time. There was no social security. So if you got screwed, there were really very few resources for you to keep you off the streets.
Great. And do you know whether HIAS Pennsylvania actually helped your family?
So I don't, unfortunately, but I would love to know. And to be honest, I would be shocked if they never crossed paths in one way or another, because my ancestors, like most people, most Jews in that immigrant generation, they were not, they came here with, at best, a little bit of money to get them through a couple of weeks, if even, of rent and food and that sort of thing. Beyond that, nothing. And a lot of them, were the first in their family to come here, and they were coming from small towns where, there may not have been anyone else that they would have known to, that they could kind of, rely on or move in with or that sort of thing. So, I'm certain that, they received some help at some point or another. I'd be surprised if they didn't.
Research I have to do in our archives, which I will do, and I'll follow up with a post.
Awesome. Yeah, let me know.
Okay, so there's a question in the chat. Where did your family come live? Was it Philadelphia as their first stop, or did they land first in New York City?
So it depends. There were actually a handful of different places that some of them came in. So a lot of people did go to New York because that's simply where there were the most steamship lines. They typically, if they were to go to Philly, they'd at least stop in New York along the way. And oftentimes people were very eager to get off these boats as soon as they could, so they wouldn't mind going to New York and taking the train or something, which a lot of people did. So I think I guess I think a majority probably landed in New York first, but there were a many, particularly like if you were the first to come, you probably went through New York. But when later on, no one stayed there. At least none of my direct ancestors stayed there. They all went to Philly, which I'd really like to know why. I don't really know why, but I would love to know. Although I'm thankful for their choice. Um, but once they were settled in Philly, and then they kind of brought the rest of the family over. Typically, the rest of the family, they made it easy for them and brought them straight into Philly. But there are also people who the original Shiroff, you could say, he came through into the port of Baltimore, which I don't know why he did that, but he did. It might have just been what was available. Again, I talking about how these people were not casual immigrants, just seeking a handout or an adventure or whatever. These are people who they were in desperate situations, and so if the earliest ticket they could get out, got them in through whatever port, who cares? They'll figure it out there. They just need to get out of here first. So yeah.
Yeah. No, it's great. And it is fascinating. You said you don't know why your family went to Philly. I recently saw the Lehman trilogy, which in some ways is another story about Jewish immigrants that came in the same period. Something that they just said without blinking, and I was like, wait, I want to know more. Was that the first brother landed in New York and ended up almost immediately in Montgomery, Alabama, which to me was bizarre. Like, how did that happen? And they didn't comment in the play about it. But when he brought his two brothers over, they came to Montgomery. They had a store. I mean, that was the origins. That store in Montgomery was the origins of the Lehman Brothers business that ultimately ended up in New York.
Yeah.
But they never explained how or why they made that journey, having arrived in New York.
It's interesting because I think from what little I've been able to piece together, I think a lot of the times it was if you just heard just one thing, if somebody just said the right thing to you and just it just clicked, then it clicked. I came across one anecdote where supposedly the Pennsylvania Railroad was well known as just an American modern marvel in Eastern Europe, among Eastern European Jews in the 1880s, 1890s. And, that was just one of the things. They were like, oh, it's the most amazing thing. You've got to go just to see it and experience it. And so, it might have been one thing that inspired some of my ancestors to come to Philly, but I really, I would love to know. I have no idea why here rather than anywhere else.
Great. So I wanted to ask you, your book is great. I mean, I found it fascinating. For those of you who haven't bought it yet, the beginning really lays out a lot of the history of Jews in the Russian Empire. So starting even as early as the 1500s and the things that happened to them under the emperor, leading up to the final last straw that led to the migration. And that history is pretty fascinating. Other than knowing that Jews were oppressed, right? I mean, I don't think that's a news flash for anybody. I didn't really understand kind of the details and how they fared under different emperors and tsars. And so that was really neat. And then, of course, you get into your family and their arrival. So having done this pretty comprehensive research, what are some takeaways that you want to share with us?
I think one thing is a thought that I kept, kind of coming back to was if this happened, if the same exact circumstances were going on today, but all the laws and all of our, all society and politics was, as it is today, what would that look like? And, I'm unfortunately, I don't think I want to know what that would look like because I don't think it would be a good story. At the end of the day, um, at least in what actually happened, I think it is a good story. It's a good American story of, thankfully, we were able to take in these people who needed somewhere to go, and they clearly wanted to go here. They could have gone anywhere else in the world, and some did, most didn't. The vast majority came to the U.S. And it was, I think, a net positive for everybody involved. But if it were to happen today, I'm not sure that it would have gone down the same way. I don't think they even, would have gotten here. And it reminds me of, some of you may be familiar with the story of how during the Second World War, um, before the U.S., or maybe even it was after the U.S. was involved in it, how a ship full of Jewish refugees fleeing the Holocaust showed up, and the Roosevelt administration said, "Yeah, sorry, we can't really make an exception for that. We're kind of closed. Sorry, good luck." And that's today. I would hope most people would recognize that that's obviously, that was a mistake. That was not the right thing to do then. But sometimes you wonder if that is actually how we would respond if something like that is happening today. And so, I think when you dive into this and you spend a lot of time exploring really what was it really like for these people, not just in the US, but again, the factors that led them to that, that moment of I have to get out of here. I don't care how bad it is. I don't care how much it costs. I don't care how unpleasant it is. I don't care if I go and I show up and they say, sorry, you have to go back. I don't care. I just have to get out. When you really think about the kinds of things that put people into those positions and to have that kind of realization, um, you realize that, like, the narratives out there about, people looking for handouts or whatever, you can't apply that backwards if you know what happened and you know what drove those people to come to the US, because it's just so obviously not at all even close to the reality. And then, so then what is the difference today? I don't think it's any different today. I don't think it's just that, oh, well, back then, the immigrants were they were good, and they wanted to work hard, and they wanted to, contribute to American society and all that. But now they don't. Now they just want, free stuff and whatever else people think that they just get for whatever reason. Um, that's just, it's not the case. And um, I think I think knowing the story and knowing really what made it happen, it uh, kind of keeps you from having those delusions, I guess, in some sense. Um, and you sort of really realize that the world has changed a lot in the last 100 years, but we're still living in the same world in some sense, and that there are a lot of people who today are in very similar circumstances to those that my ancestors were in 100 years ago. But unlike them, uh, it's not as easy as just, okay, well, let's just get out and try our luck somewhere else. um, that process can take years. It may never happen. Um, you may get here and then be told, actually, we know you've been here a decade, 2 decades, and you never really, you've never had any problems with law or anything, but now we've decided we want you to go. And I think that's just it's unfortunate, and it's really just it's alarming and sad, I guess, in some sense, because you know, we should be proud of the fact that the U.S. took in as many Jewish immigrants, and to be honest, really refugees might even be a better term for them in this period. We should be proud of that. We should be proud of the fact that we did not, even though our record wasn't perfect with anti-Semitism, it was nothing nearly as terrible as what they were coming from, and we should be proud of that. Um, but it's kind of unfortunate that we're not living up to that really anymore. Um, hopefully, anybody who reads this kind of gets a sense of how important it was for us to have that, to fill that role as a safe haven for persecuted peoples of the world, people in just bad circumstances for whatever reason. And hopefully we can try to get back to something closer to that role that we used to fulfill quite well.
I really appreciate those remarks. And for those of you who don't know, the ship that Taylor is referring to is a St. Louis that was turned away on June 6, 1939. There were 937 passengers, and 2/3 of them were murdered by the Nazis when they went back to Europe. So it's absolutely real. And the reason those facts are at my fingertips are because, of course, June 6th, right? We just celebrated the anniversary. And in honor of it, I created a post, which I had intended, weeks before to create a post in honor of the anniversary. But 2 days before the anniversary, President Biden entered an executive order shutting the border down to asylum seekers and others. So ironically, I mean, it's not that it could happen again. It is happening again. Now that said, a few days ago, President Biden also entered a very positive executive order allowing people that have been undocumented but married to a citizen and living here for decades to adjust their legal status. So that's a positive move, but we're turning people away in droves who need help, and we're turning them back to their deaths. I mean, I'm not trying to be melodramatic. That's very, very real. And in fact, it's been real, sadly, for decades. There was a study done when El Salvadorans were turned away, and something like 1 in every 4 that was deported was murdered. They were able to follow them. So, it's really, I think we have to ask ourselves, what is our responsibility to our, to fellow humans? I also think, although I would, advocate for more welcoming policies across the world, particularly in this moment where there's such large displacement, the United States has a special responsibility because ultimately we are a nation of immigrants. Native Americans were murdered by us. So there is no such thing as, the original people, such that immigrants are somehow other. Immigrants really are us. So, we need to be leaders on this question. I think the other thing, that I want to highlight, which didn't come out necessarily in Taylor's book because it's not directly relevant to the era that he was dealing with, but it's ironic that there's this resurgence of anti-immigrant rhetoric in a moment in our history when we need immigrants more than they need us. The reality is that we're suffering from population declines. There's been articles almost every week. There was one just this Sunday in the Washington Post about a town in Pennsylvania that is literally dying. They closed their school, they closed their hospital. They They canceled their annual festival that they've had for more than 100 years. And they have 3 open positions on city council that they can't fill because the birth rate has been declining and the mortality rate has been increasing. And so there just are literally no people in that town. And they are certainly not alone. Pew just came out with a really important study that showed that Philadelphia suffered huge demographic losses and continues to suffer them. And the only reason we are surviving is because of our immigrants. So, so it's really ironic that, as I said, that, you know, there's this anti-immigrant rhetoric from an immigrant nation at a moment when we need immigrants more than they need us. Yeah, I just wanted to stress that. So in the chat, there's another question along these lines. Does the book address the fate of those who remained in Ukraine in the 1880s, whether in your family, Taylor, or in the general community they came from?
Yeah, so it does. And part of that's because it was actually my ancestors in Ukraine who were both the first and the last to leave for the United States. So the last only left in 1908, 1907, 1908. And I carry it a little bit beyond that as well, because that's actually it's almost a little annoying that that's when my ancestors left, because that's where the period that period of Jewish history and Ukrainian history, like, it starts to really collide and gets really interesting. But you know, I can't let the book become too long, so unfortunately I couldn't talk too much about it. But there's a lot of really interesting stuff in the book that I talk about in that period, because it was a very interesting time, because that's where, you know, not only are the Jews starting to get really, really seriously fed up with just being permanent, you know, second class citizens in lands in which they've lived for centuries, but also, you know, the Ukrainians are starting to feel that same way. The Poles are starting to feel that same way. And you know, the ways in which their paths sort of cross in that period is interesting. It was occasionally quite destructive. It was occasionally actually quite productive for both parties, and it's really a very interesting thing. So yeah, there's a bit of the book that goes up to and sort of um, so, you know, I don't give a complete treatment of the Holocaust, because I just couldn't possibly do that in, you know, a book of this length. But I do you know, a sort of a brief overview to sort of um, close out the story of the old world. So yeah, there's definitely stuff in there from, you know, Ukraine past the 1880s.
Great. Before getting closing thoughts, I wanted to open it up to other questions. Does anyone have anything that you want to ask? Remember to unmute yourself.
Yeah, I do. I do.
Mm-hmm.
Taylor, what kind of papers did people get who wanted to leave? What kind of papers were they able to get in Ukraine? What kind of papers were requested by people in charge of boats and people in charge of entering different countries on their way to the boat, perhaps?
Yeah, so the short answer is not much, because the whole thing was kind of it was of ambiguous legality at the very least. It was kind of a weird thing, because the empire, the Russian Empire, you know, had made very clear that they really weren't that fond of the Jews. You know, first, you know, maybe if you were at least willing to convert, they might tolerate you. Eventually, they decided even if you convert, you know, you're always a Jew, and you know, you're never going to be able to settle in a Russian life. And so they kind of um, you know, adopted a strategy of, well, maybe we can just make things so bad that they leave on their own, which technically was illegal, because they weren't allowed to leave the Pale of Settlement, which was the sort of region that the empire had set aside to kind of restrict the Jews to live in. And so while you weren't allowed to leave it, they also really wanted you to leave it, which meant that you know, a lot of people were I don't want to say smuggled, but in some cases they were really smuggled across borders, often into Austria-Hungary, which was to the southwest, or into Germany, and oftentimes that was at midnight. You'd get off the train, a stop or two ahead of the border, and you would walk. Sometimes you would walk a very long time. Um, Sometimes you would walk for days until you were somewhere that you could, get back on the train or into whatever to get where you were going. And then from there, there was sort of some like I guess like unofficial, but sort of things that they decided to do. The boat companies who were uh, shipping these people to the U.S. Because a problem that they kept running into was um, if you uh, if you sold a ticket to somebody to come to the U.S. and they get to the U.S. and it turns out that they have some really contagious disease or something that that was going to get them turned away. Um, Not only were they not going to be let into the U.S., but you also had to return them. But the thing is, that person only bought a ticket to get to the U.S. They didn't buy a ticket to come back. And so that expense was paid by the shipping company. These shipping companies clearly really wanted to avoid paying that if they could. And so they started implementing all these health checks for, I mean, really any disease you could imagine, in addition to ones that really probably weren't even real, where they would kind of put you in the quarantine a couple of times on your way out. And you'd have to pass that, and they'd give you a little slip of paper that, you could show to people saying, yes, I don't have, whatever disease, I'm okay. And so they sort of put that into place on their own. But in terms of like official documentation, it was, you know, uh, there really wasn't much. Most Jews weren't really allowed to have passports in the Russian Empire. Some did, but they were exceedingly rare. Typically, only if you knew a guy who knew a guy or had a lot of money. But like, both cases kind of rare.
Oh, you're muted, Jim. You're muted.
Thank you. When they got to the US, did they need a document or did they just say, help me? Or,
Yeah,
I'm here, I have a relative in the city, I want to come in or something.
yeah, that's pretty much exactly what it was. These people really didn't have really many documents, if any at all. I mean, so their birth certificate, to the extent they had a birth certificate, was a record in a book kept in the local synagogue. And obviously they weren't going to have that on them as they came to the U.S. They weren't going to have passports. There were no IDs, certainly no driver's licenses. There was nothing really that they generally had. And so when you showed up, um, so your name was recorded in a passenger list. So they knew who was on the boat. And so if you showed up, claiming to be somebody, and your name was clearly not on a list, and that would get some questions. But typically it was, you showed up, you passed their health inspection, and you're not obviously trying to cause trouble or something. And you hopefully it helps if you knew somebody who was here already, if you had some family who could vouch for you or something like that. But even if you didn't, as long as you passed those checks, you were kind of good to go. Which, as I said earlier, is very much so not the case today. It's almost, it's why it's kind of hard to imagine, because it's just so different from what people have to go through today. But it was really kind of that simple in a sense back then.
Okay.
Great, thank you. I think we have time for one more question, if anyone has one. Don't forget to unmute if you have a question. Okay, then Taylor, my final question to you is just, what closing thoughts do you want to share with us?
Yeah, I think I said a lot of it already, but I think really just to emphasize it, that when you read this and you think about the things these people went through at every stage of their experience, whether before they came to the U.S., as they're coming to the U.S., when they show up, and afterwards, to I guess just appreciate the fact that it was possible, and to think about what we can do to, help people who are in the exact same situation today that those people were in, but, for whom it's just so much harder, if not impossible, to do the same things that, in our lives, we just take for granted that, oh, well, my ancestors showed up here and it was, kind of as easy as showing up and saying your name and, that sort of thing. And it was, but that's, again, not the case anymore. And, I think, we should be mindful of that, both in the sense of, making sure that we help people as much as we can, who are, in need today, but also, to remind ourselves that, people who want to come to the U.S. today are no different than those who did 100 years ago. People 100 years ago were not coming here because there were handouts or, whatever, they weren't bringing their crime and the drugs or whatever. That's not what they were doing. It's not what people want to do now. The reality is that it's, it was a really unpleasant thing. It was, they were living really unpleasant, very dangerous, and just really unfortunate lives, to the point where they were willing to do anything to come here at any cost, and they were desperate, and that's what people who want to immigrate to the U.S. today, they're no different than those people, 120 years ago in that sense. And it's unfortunate that what is different is that, unlike then, we've put a lot of barriers in the way, to getting them to, where they want and honestly, in a sense, need to be. Yeah, I think with that, I'll leave it there.
Great. Thank you so much, Taylor. We really appreciate what you've shared with us today and your book. And we have run out of time. So for all of you who want to learn more about support DACA recipients, asylum seekers, and other immigrants and refugees, you can go to our website, which I'll put in the chat. It's www.hiaspa.org. And to purchase Taylor's book, you can go to and put Taylor Shiroff Next Year in America in the search box. So I'm just putting that in the chat, so that you can get it. And again, just to repeat what I said in the beginning, the recording will be up on our website in a few days or early next week, and will also be circulated to our mailing list. Please feel free to share the recording with friends and family. I think it's a really great book, fascinating and timely. And so I would urge all of you to share the interview and share the book with the people that you know and within your networks. Thank you very, very much.
Yeah, thank you, and thanks everyone for being here. Appreciate it.